procurement to invoke greater value for libraries. I'm Jenny May. I'm from Imperial College London, where I work as Metadata Services Coordinator. And I'm here with Gavin Philips, who's going to start us off. So over to Gavin.
Morning, everybody. So yes, as Diane said, I'm the category manager at SUPC. I'll talk a little bit about who or what SUPC are later. I started this role back in January. So before that, I spent over 20 years as an academic librarian, most recently as acquisitions manager at Imperial. And if you uncover the various layers of my CV and go back about 15 years, you'll see that I was once a cataloguer. So why are we referencing dark arts here? Well, I think that both metadata and procurement are both fairly complex areas with specific expertise, and both of them probably seem a little bit impenetrable to outsiders. However, both disciplines enable quite a lot of value for libraries and beyond libraries. Sometimes that is in quite subtle and magical ways, which aren't necessarily understood by the lay person. So I don't need to labour the point about why metadata adds all this value from the perspective of this audience. But what I wanted to say about procurement is that procurement is not just about sticking to regulations and rules. And it's not just about getting the best price for something, it's about value. It's how we can use the tendering process and our relationships with suppliers to enable development and innovation along the lines of what the sector requires. So what are we going to talk about today? So we're going to talk about how metadata now fits into the way that SUPC is operating. We're going to talk a bit about how we're looking to improve metadata supply using the forthcoming re-tendering of our books and ebooks agreement. And we're going to talk a bit about how we're looking ahead to the future to try and understand how we should be aligning with the sector in the future and how we might be able to help influence change along the way. So first of all, who are SUPC? I don't know how many of you know who we are. So we are the Southern Universities Purchasing Consortium. We're part of UK UPC, which is made up of 6 regional purchasing consortia across the UK. SUPC itself is a charity where we're wholly owned by our members, and as such, we're as interested in providing non-cash value to members as we are with just chasing financial advantages. The main activity of SUPC is that we let and manage framework agreements. Now, without boring you too much about all the procurement stuff, a framework agreement is basically a preset list of approved suppliers that institutions can choose from. We do that tendering process at a national level so that institutions and suppliers don't have to deal with hundreds of different procurement things. And then institutional members can then plug in their local requirements when it comes to what's called calling off from the framework. So when they're deciding who they want to use. And that minimises the amount of work they do, minimises the amount of the size of procurement teams and the amount of work that suppliers have to do with responding to tenders. So as consortia, we try to complement each other rather than duplicating effort. So one consortium will lead on agreement, the other UK UPC consortia will support. And in the library space, that's not just the UK UPC, but the academic library consortia as well, such as Wealth and Noel and Nail and Newell. If you're a member of those, you'll know who they are. So SUPC happens to lead a couple of agreements in the library space. One is for books and ebooks, and one is for periodicals. These are accessed by all members in England and Wales. Scotland operates separately. There are some different procurement regulations up in Scotland, so it's a bit more appropriate for them to do something different. Metadata, of course, is directly relevant to the books and ebooks framework, less so periodicals at the moment. It's worth talking a little bit about the metadata advisor role that was introduced in January. So my whole approach to metadata and the creation of this role basically stems from my time working with Jenny at Imperial. I already had a decent base understanding of metadata, but it was working with Jenny that really opened up the potential of metadata and discovery for me. So when I took on this new role with SUPC, I knew I wanted a metadata advisor. And I'm really pleased that the person who inspired me so much was willing to take the role and continue associating with me. I'm also grateful to Imperial, of course, for allowing her the time to work with me as well. But I will really need to let Jenny tell you about that role.
So this role works alongside the 2 library representatives for the Books Contract Management Group, who support Gavin in framework activities. And they're currently Andrew Knight, who's also from Imperial College, and Maria Allen, who's from King's College. So the metadata advisor will have input into framework activities as well, including both the agreement and supplier performance reviews. And Gavin will explain more about exactly what that means later on. So the metadata input for the books retender has only really started over the summer, but Gavin and I have been working together since he started in January, trying to build relationships with key stakeholders in the metadata supply chain to discuss how things are changing and what opportunities this creates for a more streamlined supply of metadata. The impact of the National Bibliographic Knowledge Base is a particularly important development, with its potential for simplifying the sourcing of records for both libraries and for framework suppliers. We're also advocating for the importance of metadata among SUPC member institutions. I provided an update on metadata for the commodity group meeting in June, which is a meeting attended by representatives from member libraries. Gavin has also set up a metadata special interest group for SUPC and LEPC institutions. This filled the gap for a special interest group in the south of England, and we're now composed of over 60 members. It's still a bit informal because it's so new, and we don't have a chair yet. Gavin's our unofficial chair because he organises regular coffee mornings for the group, and these have been a really great way to network with other metadata professionals whilst we've all been working from home. So thank you, Gavin. Finally, we're also looking to align with other consortia on metadata. So earlier in the year, we contributed to the metadata requirements of the APUC streaming video framework. APUC are the Scottish equivalent of SUPC, but libraries across England and Wales will have access to that framework too. So we've got an interest in those metadata requirements. So if I could have the next slide, please. So how can we embed metadata further into the framework? Suppliers on the framework should be able to provide MARC records if required, which may have a cost, but the framework currently lacks guidance as to the format and standards of that metadata. Many libraries are reliant on shelf-ready metadata, including us at Imperial, but they have little control over what is provided to them by suppliers. Building more detailed metadata requirements into the framework provides clarity for suppliers as to how they can meet the expectations of libraries. Speaking from personal experience, and I'm sure it's the same for many libraries, our resources are wasted in checking and amending shelf-ready metadata. Shelf-ready metadata isn't actually shelf-ready because we need to go in and quality control the metadata that's provided. And some libraries won't have the capacity to do any kind of checking or quality control of their shelf-ready metadata at all, which is even worse. So by working to improve shelf-ready metadata via the framework, less manual intervention is required, and quality metadata is available as soon as resources are supplied to libraries. So if I could have the next slide, please. So what exactly are the problems with the current agreement? It wasn't created with any recent input from metadata professionals, and the main problem with the requirements is that they are too vague. So for Lot 1 for print book supply, the requirements state that records should be according to AACR2, RDA or any other current or future recognised standard to the level specified by the library. They should be subject indexed according to Library of Congress subject headings, British Library standards, which aren't specified but are maybe fast, or whatever is required by the library. And the final requirement is that suppliers should be able to accommodate any specific cataloguing requests required by the library. So I think these are quite high standards that suppliers are expected to meet, basically whatever the library needs, but there are no specifics. So for suppliers, this isn't particularly helpful. And it isn't helpful for libraries either, because it means that if the quality of records is substandard, they will have to negotiate with suppliers and explain themselves what is wrong without being able to refer to specifics in the framework. There's also inconsistencies in the metadata requirements between lots. So for lots 4 and 5, which are for ebook supply, the only requirement for MARC records is that RDA is preferred, but it's not mandatory. Also, none of the requirements for print books lot supply. So what this means is that suppliers are not obliged to provide an RDA record with subject indexing for ebooks, which is obviously not what we want. Currently, there isn't any evaluation of suppliers with regards to metadata in the framework. Gavin will explain in more detail later on about supplier evaluation in framework activities, but basically at the moment, there isn't much discussion with suppliers about metadata, and this is something that we really want to change. And we'd like the framework to be part of all the big conversations that are happening at the moment in metadata and to help support developments that are coming. Again, we will expand on this more later on, but at the moment we feel that metadata requirements in the framework are not linked to wider concerns or future requirements. So over to Gavin to talk more about the current framework.
Okay, so the next agreement, the next framework agreement is due to go live in summer 2021, and that tender is likely to be issued possibly the very beginning of 2021, maybe just squeeze it in at the end of 2020. It will deal with print books, it will deal with aggregation ebooks, and also with e-text books. And at the moment, we're currently finalising the strategy for this, which will shortly be going out to consortium members for consultation. Whilst that's happening, we'll start to write the specification and get down to the nitty-gritty of what people will be, what suppliers will be expected to do. So I do not want to go into all of the detail about procurement processes, but I do want to cover broadly how it works and how we see metadata fitting into that. So really there are two areas that we're looking to consider here. So one is the tender specification itself, which is what we need suppliers to do at the moment and how we will evaluate them on those requirements. The second element is the contract management, which is how we want to work with these suppliers over the 4-year life of that agreement, making sure that sector developments are tied in so that we're not dealing with a 4-year step. Instead, we've got more of a curve of development. So my framework inputs, of course, I have my metadata advisor, I have Jenny herself, and not unlimited access to her, but a great deal of access to her. There's also the NAG Quality of Shelfready Metadata Survey and Report, which is, I think, a really strong piece of work. And I'm not going to spoil that ahead of Emma's presentation, which is coming after us. We've also got the supplier and supply chain engagement going on. So we're talking to current suppliers on the current agreement. We're also talking to potential suppliers for the next agreement, as well as other metadata stakeholders involving the likes of JISC, SILIP MDG, BDS, and so on. What that allows us to do is it gives opinions on our current thinking, and it identifies any barriers to where we want to get to, which we may need to accommodate in the process. It also helps to take advantage of supplier expertise. It's one thing to say that we have all these library stakeholders and they have all this expertise and we need services which meet those requirements. But actually, the suppliers themselves and those stakeholders are hugely knowledgeable, and we need to be able to take advantage of that as well. Wider consultation question mark, because I haven't actually decided yet. I think we have got wider consultation built into the NAG work that was completed by metadata experts, but we may well need a bit more wider consultation if we need to flesh out certain things. Watch this space, and I imagine that the regional metadata special interest groups will be an avenue for that. So onto those two areas I talked about earlier, the first being tender specification. What we're getting down to here is identifying 3 types of questions that we want to be asking suppliers. So there will be mandatory requirements. These are sort of sets a minimum capability that suppliers must meet in order to get onto a framework. If a supplier fails any one of these mandatory requirements, then they're disqualified from further evaluation in the tender process and they cannot get onto the framework, and there's nothing that can be done to change that. So we need to be careful with it, but it's also a powerful tool. We then have scored requirements, and these really allow members, when they're selecting a supplier, to see actually who is the most capable of them in certain respects. What we would do is we would, as well as having the questions, we will talk about, or we will inform suppliers about how we're going to evaluate them. That's a legal requirement. And then we would have a panel. I have a tender working party set up around this, and we will evaluate those and score, and then we will review those scores to make sure that they actually make sense and that we're not having disagreements. Finally, there's the for information only questions, which are interesting because they can be quite niche, but they can be quite a powerful tool as well. So these are often, as I say, niche requirements, often more forward-looking requirements, but some libraries might choose to incorporate as mandatory requirements when they're calling off and making their decision for supplier. Other libraries might not care at all. They might not have the technical capability for that requirement. So we don't want scores affected either. One of the really great things about using this is that it helps to indicate areas that we want to see developing, that we're not necessarily going to hold suppliers to right now. So I'll give you an example. In the last agreement, we were seeing a lot of development around API functionality. Some suppliers had API ordering functionality that worked with, for example, Alma. Others didn't. Other LMS just couldn't cope with it anyway, so it wasn't a wide need. But by asking that question, what are your capabilities, we were able to firstly allow institutions to rule out suppliers who didn't have the requirement. That's the way I approached call-off at Imperial. At the same time, we triggered some development. I did hear from suppliers who were maybe behind the curve slightly on that, who were saying that actually seeing it in the tender meant they had to get to know more about what APIs did, and they had to start working that into their development schedule. And I hope that we can find ways of doing that in other areas this time around, including perhaps metadata. So the other thing is that over time, these requirements can rise up this scale. So what is maybe in the last agreement around APIs as a for information only question is probably now going to be at least scored. In some respects, it may creep into mandatory requirements as well. It's a way of charting and triggering that development over time. So how will we handle this for metadata this time around? Back in February, when we were writing the proposal for this, we were expecting to have most of this nailed down by now. And of course, with the world slightly off its axis, we're a little bit behind. But what I think I can say is that the NAG work it's extremely strong. And what it really does is it identifies what seems to be widely accepted as key areas that need to be included. But there's also lots of great information on what are the most desirable of the desirable elements, and what are things which are maybe a bit more niche. And I think we can work to include these requirements and fit those into these mandatory scored and information only categories. We might also add 1 or 2 extra questions as well, which maybe are partially covered by NAG or maybe not covered. One of these, for example, could be, I'm interested in how metadata can be supporting the open access monograph landscape. So we may well ask 1 or 2 questions around that. I'm not quite sure yet whether those would be scored or information only, but there's an opportunity for us to support as much sector work as possible. So onto the contract management element of this. This is what happens once the agreement is live and we have 4 years of working with suppliers. So this is based around a review meeting structure. These occur every 6 months. The point of them is firstly to review spend and performance, but also to talk about supplier developments. They're underpinned by KPIs and also by member feedback via a survey. So we can use them to ensure that minimum standards are being adhered to, but they also provide us measures which we can use as a scaffolding to guide our discussion with suppliers. We might decide to set targets during this thing. So if, for example, one of our requirements is going to take a lot of development and we can't reasonably expect suppliers to have it in place at point of tender, we might say we would expect it by the end of year 1 of the agreement, for instance.
Sorry to interrupt, just to let you know, we just have a minute or 2 left in your presentation time. So we have time for questions, if that's okay.
Oh, right, okay. Sorry, I thought we had half an hour.
Yeah, we're trying to do 20 minutes and then 10
Ah, okay, sorry. Okay, so in that case, to move on. So how we might handle that with metadata, for example. Again, to be decided. I think what I can see is a group of us working together, the likes of Jenny, maybe replicated across the consortia, to try and create that sort of inner sanctum of metadata experts to give us that input. And that kind of leads us back to Jenny and what we'll be looking at for the future.
So yeah, we're already beginning to think beyond the 2021 framework and to consider the long-term strategy for metadata. So we'll be working out where we can support and align with metadata developments. These ideas have really come out of the very useful conversations that we've had with different stakeholders in the metadata supply chain. And our aim is really just to continue to be engaged with the progress that's being made to streamline supply. So if I could have the next slide, please. So firstly, the changing metadata supply chain. The way in which data is created and paid for is being scrutinised heavily at the moment with Plan M. We don't yet know how this might affect metadata requirements in the framework. It could be that an itemised cost for records is no longer viable and that data costs will be covered instead by a subscription or licence. However, if that is the case, we still want to play a role in facilitating communication between libraries and metadata creators. Metadata creators are obviously not limited to framework suppliers, and data supplied by framework suppliers may originate from cataloguing agencies or publishers anyway. We would like to support any efforts to unify bibliographic standards across the sector. A common understanding of the meaning of data elements is crucial for ensuring that data can be exchanged seamlessly between applications across scholarly communications. Metadata requirements in the framework should be aligned as closely as possible with developments such as the NISO report on ebook metadata and the Metadata 2020 project to ensure that data can be shared widely and repurposed for uses outside of the library catalogue. Efficiency in the data supply chain could be improved by increased communication between creators of publisher metadata and creators of MARC records, who may convert ONIX data into MARC. This could reduce the duplication of effort involved in creating the data. There are also some ONIX data fields that are not typically included in a MARC record that may contain useful information for libraries, such as the 196 ONIX codes that contain accessibility information. This data could perhaps be surfaced in library management systems or discovery layers to display when a resource has accessibility features, or it could be used in some kind of filtering option so users can find resources that work for them. So this is an example of how valuable data is getting lost, and there are perhaps many other examples like this that could be discovered if it's looked into a little deeper by the right people. And lastly, the adoption of new standards and data formats. Libraries need to ensure that their data is future-proof and ready for a linked data environment. As a first step in encouraging the adoption of linked open data practices, the 2021 framework will include subfield 0 URIs as a desirable element in MARC records. And this is one of the recommendations from the NAG report, which Emma will be talking about in the next presentation and is going to directly inform the next framework. So it's only a desirable field at the moment, but this could change in future. And that's why it's really important that we keep alert to future developments, in particular RDA and linked data. And we also want to seek a wider input from the metadata community to ensure that we can serve everyone's needs. Members use different systems and obviously have very different collections, so we need to find out what's appropriate for everyone. And I'll hand back to Gavin.
Okay, so I think you'll have an idea by now that a lot of this is a work in process, a work in progress rather, and much of what we're trying to do is a little bit new. And in that sense, it kind of fits in with what's going on in the metadata landscape. There's a lot of dialogues going on in different ways, a lot of potential dialogues that might start, and we're trying to fit in around that. In a way, we feel a bit like this cat here, in that we're poking our head over the wall to assess the situation and what is going on. And a key thing for us is to be a part of these dialogues where appropriate, and certainly to be a part of this community. So what I'm really hoping is it will be interesting to see where we get to with this and reflect back once the agreement is live. And I really hope that maybe in a couple of years' time, there might be an opportunity for us to actually speak to you again around what we've achieved rather than what we plan to achieve, and also what we see the next developments as being. So thank you for your time. I think we can be open to questions now, I think.
Thanks. If I just could remind everyone, if you do have questions, to put them in the chat, and I'll read them out and ask them for you. While we're waiting, I just want to say that's a really interesting talk. Thanks for this. It's not the side of things that I typically even teach on, and it makes me think as a teacher of cataloging that maybe we need to be letting students know that this kind of thing is going on. We tend to not focus on this side, on the acquisition side as much as sort of the more hands-on practical aspects and the theoretical aspects of cataloging. But that's something that I've taken away from this, is that they were prepared for this in the future as well.
It's typically an area which does work with acquisitions managers and subscriptions managers as well, less so on the metadata side because of the way that subscriptions agents work. But my view of it is that metadata is a sort of key at underpinning value for money. And as I explained to my colleagues at SUPC, if you can't find it, you can't use it.
That's right.
And if you can't use it, if you're spending £10,000 a year on some hugely expensive e-textbook, but people can't find it, you're going to get poor value for money. And then that issue around the way it underpins student experience as well is really important. And that's something which consortia are having to look at to show their value. We're all having to show our value in difficult times. And this is, for me, it's really a key thing which has been overlooked for a long time.
Yeah, definitely. I encounter that myself just as the representative to the library for my department, as sort of the academic staff side as well as being a librarian. It's a bit interesting to see both sides as well, to kind of say, well, we really need this ebook, especially considering the circumstances, and trying to negotiate that, and the pricing is just, for me, it's a bit, it just boggles my mind, honestly, in some cases. I've had a couple of comments as well about the metadata advisor for each consortium, and that it was a great idea. And they're interested to know a little bit more about replicating metadata advisors across the sector.
At the moment, this is a formative idea. This is what I think is possibly the best way forward to do this. So what I would want to do is to, obviously getting this, actually this is really useful feedback as well, but to actually raise this through my contract management group. They're representing all of these consortia, and get them to then, and they work on who they provide to help me. So I would sort of say, how about a metadata person? They'll really want to say in how these things are going to develop over time. So yeah, I think I don't have an exact answer for you, is the answer, but I see it coming soon.
Yeah, I agree, that makes sense. Helen has a question. First of all, she says, great proposals, but she asks, how can we feed into the process of quality control in the future?
I think what we will be doing is, alongside perhaps having this group of representatives, we send out an annual survey, which usually goes to the acquisitions and subscriptions managers. And that underpins our national reviews, which we hold in the autumn. So we have a national review and then local reviews 6 months later. And what I would like is to overhaul that survey to make sure that metadata requirements are being explored within it properly. So I would imagine people like Jenny, and perhaps I have a Welsh Jenny and a Northeastern Jenny, etc. Cockney Jenny from London, maybe, who knows. But maybe getting them to input into actually what those questions need to be and what we can reasonably expect library metadata managers to answer. And then, I mean, from that we work with suppliers, but we might find that actually what we need to do is not just engage with suppliers, but increase our engagement with metadata groups as well. Likely, I see the regional metadata groups as being really valuable this way, and well, we have our own down in London and the South, but how do we bring in those other ones as well? It's formative, I suppose, at the moment.
Right. We have a few more questions now coming in. I just want to say that it is the formal end of your presentation time, but if you're happy to stay on and answer these questions, if everyone else can go have a break if they would like, but would you mind answering a few more before we start our next session, if that's okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Natasha is wondering, she noticed that your purchasing agreements are very book focused, and will you be expanding to serials at all?
The serials agreement runs, that's the last one went live last year, so that it will run till 2023. So in maybe May 2022, we'll start working on that. I actually do have it as a sort of outcome of the sessions on Monday. Jenny and I have it as an outcome to discuss what we might be able to do in serials. That agreement, though, it works with subscriptions agents. So these are people who are not providing metadata typically. That's coming through other routes, through publishers, which we don't have a reach to via the agreement, but potentially we can build that kind of environment in. It's something we need to discuss and to actually work out how effective we can actually be. Because if we're not going to be effective, we need to use what limited capacity we have to do other things. But yeah, I definitely want us to be exploring that.
And there was just a point of clarification from Helen from her previous question. What she said is that what she meant is they're a collective way to monitor errors and quality from suppliers. We haven't got to that stage yet, to be honest. I think what it will be is not necessarily, I don't see it likely to be every single record is somehow monitored and reported back to me. I think it will be a case of how satisfied are you as an SUPC or an EUPC member in what you're getting and its adherence to what we've set out. I don't think we'll see, we never see perfection on anything. And in fact, somebody not getting 100% on something isn't a trigger for us kicking them off the framework. It's a trigger to a discussion and working out what the challenges are. And maybe we need to reset some of our expectations as a result. So I think it's going to come mainly through expressions of satisfaction rather than a sort of, I suppose, qualitative rather than quantitative feedback. Great. Just one comment and one question left here, really, and then we'll get set up for the next speakers, if that's okay. Amy just wanted to thank you. She says, it's great to know that this work is happening and that the profile of metadata is being promoted. We're starting to see the benefits of getting professionally involved in the processes rather than letting others decide what metadata we receive. Yeah, actually, I couldn't agree with that more myself. And the question from Sandra was, does the NBK have a role here as well, and how might such a relationship play out?
Yes, this is one of those other dialogues that's going on, which is working to a different time frame than we are. We're in touch with them. We've had discussions earlier in the year, just before lockdown, with Neil and co. We've been taking part in the Plan M stuff as well. So, I mean, Jenny's been working on Plan M with Imperial since the beginning anyway. But we're inputting into that process. We talked to Tracy, who's been the consultant for JISC on this. And in fact, I know that a lot of the licensing side of Plan M is being discussed this morning. So we couldn't attend that, unfortunately, because we were already here. But we're linked in with those people. In fact, we'll be inputting offline after that event anyway. So it's kind of joining up. In some ways, we won't be able to say 100%, this is what we need to do to support Plan M and the NBK. But what we can make sure we're doing is trying to make sure the doors are open and we're not putting up barriers to what those things need to achieve. So it's around, a lot of it is around alignment with what's going on.
Right. So yeah, thanks very much. That was a really, really informative talk, and I'm glad to see that this is going on, actually. Thanks again, and hopefully you can, if you can stay for the breakout session after the next paper, then we can put you into some rooms and for some further chat. That's all right?
Absolutely, yes. Thank you for your time, everybody.